Hello economics students. In today's video lecture, I introduce the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model is a very useful tool as it allows us to predict changes in the price level, which we also know as inflation or deflation, as well as changes in real GDP, which can tell us if we are moving into or away from recession in the economy. In the model, we place real GDP on the horizontal axis. So we have our usual two-dimensional graph, and so over here is real gross domestic, I can write the letter D, product. And on the vertical axis, we put the price level, which is usually measured by the GDP deflator, one of our price index models that we talked about. If there is a shift in either aggregate supply or aggregate demand that causes the price level to increase, an increasing price level, going up this axis, is the definition of inflation. Then such shifts will be inflationary. I'll show you one in a minute. The first line I'm going to put in the graph is neither aggregate demand or aggregate supply, but a marker for the full employment level of output. This will be a vertical line, and we usually denote that Y with a subscript F for full employment, and say that's $9,500 billion, okay? Some refer to this as the long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. The long-run aggregate supply curve level of real output is our target for the economy, where we are at full employment, say with a low unemployment rate of between 4 and 5%. Currently, the unemployment rate, as I'm doing this lecture, is 4.9%. So we're probably in the economy very close to full employment. Next, let's consider how producers react to changes in the price level to get the aggregate supply curve. As the price level rises for finished goods and services with input prices unchanged, producers will want to produce more in the short run to take advantage of higher prices. This gives us an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. In the longer term, as producers expand their output in the economy, input prices will be bid up, and the effect of increasing output is only a short-run phenomenon. Can the aggregate supply curve cross the full employment level and be more than full employment, as I have it here in the picture? The answer is yes, it can, as the nation's factories and workers go on overtime. The aggregate demand curve relates how buyers react to changes in the price level in their purchases of the nation's finished goods and services, which we know as real GDP. As the price level falls, money in the bank and other liquid assets has more purchasing power, called the wealth effect. So as the price level falls, real demand goes up, giving us a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Another reason for the downsloping aggregate demand curve is the interest rate effect. A lower price level means a lower inflation rate, which means nominal interest rates fall. This stimulates purchases of big-ticket items like new cars and houses, so we again get a downsloping effect on the aggregate demand curve. There's even a third reason for a downsloping curve, the foreign price effect, that argues for the curve being sloped downward, but I'll leave that to your reading in chapter 24. Putting all three curves together, we get a picture that looks like this. Note the image above is from your textbook on page 502. In the diagram, we have a short-run equilibrium at point E with the price level at, say, 90. If you want to put a number on it. and real GDP, coming down to the real GDP axis of Y1, or $8,800 billion. Is this good news or bad news in the way I've drawn the picture today? Well, with the full employment of potential real GDP at $9,500 and the economy operating at only $8,800, then we have a gap here between the two of 9,500 minus 8,800, or $700 billion. This isn't good news. This is called a recessionary gap, and the economy is not operating at full employment. So the obvious question is, how do we improve the situation? One of the four components of aggregate demand is government spending. Remember, aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So an increase in government spending, such as for infrastructure in the economy, such as new bridges for interstate highways, by the federal government would increase aggregate demand. Note that both presidential candidates in the 2016 election contest are proposing this sort of thing. So we will get a second aggregate demand curve, aggregate demand 2, and we would shift aggregate demand to the right, called an increase in aggregate demand. This will increase our short-run equilibrium to point G. Okay. But notice that the downside is we have an increase in the price level. So price level goes up. But notice that real GDP also goes up. So the good news is we're no longer in recession. The bad news is it might cost us some increase in the price level or inflation to get there. Are there other ways to do this? Well, for example, at the government level, they could also cut taxes. A tax cut by the government would work in a very similar way by stimulating more consumption spending. And then that would shift aggregate demand to the right as well and give us this same effect. Both increasing government spending or cutting taxes are examples of expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is using the government's budget to manage the economy. Monetary policy is another tool, but it's under the direction not of Congress and the President, but of our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. They could shift aggregate demand to the right by having monetary policymakers increase the money supply, which would drive down interest rates, which would increase the investment spending component of aggregate demand. Please review the causes of a shift in aggregate supply curve, and you'll be ready to use this model to predict inflation and changes in real GDP. Thank you. It was great talking to you today about one of my favorite subjects, aggregate demand and aggregate supply.